Just an overview of some of the items that we wanted to go over with you all here today. I won't read through all of these, but I did want to hit on a couple of these items in the outline, just mentioning some of the project purpose and the objectives, some of the nuts and bolts of the tool and the functionality, and then some planned enhancements that are currently underway, as well as some future work that is recommended. So the project purpose, the research project had three primary objectives. They're located on the slide. The goal was to formalize a systematic approach to a fleet replacement to assist fleet managers as they go through the replacement decision-making process. We also sought out to develop a tool that was easy to use and accessible. In other words, Excel. For this, most people have Excel on their machine. Avoid the cost of some maybe more expensive fleet replacement software. And I'll get into some of the reasons behind that in a little bit in the presentation, but again, we did choose to use Excel so that it was something the folks all had access to. I did want to hit on a couple of the high points of the importance of fleet replacement, starting with the fact that equipment's an asset. We view it as such. It should be managed as such. Pavement and bridge and some of the other ancillary assets get a lot of the attention, but equipment is vital to supporting the agency's overall asset management mission. So if anything came out of this project, it's hopefully that we can shed some more light on the importance of fleet management and how it can be incorporated into an overall asset management strategy. Unfortunately, as you all are well aware, equipment replacement is one of the first places that decision makers look to rein in some spending. Even though most people understand that's false economy or bad business for a couple reasons, but certainly keeping equipment too long ends up costing you more money in the long run. Again, that's fairly obvious to most folks, but still doesn't necessarily translate into the most effective budget decisions. But also, as the equipment ages, the downtime can increase, and it makes it more difficult for the agency to deliver on its mission. And again, that speaks to the importance of developing that systematic approach for fleet replacement. There are obviously real-world dollar and cents benefits to effective fleet replacement. Reduced costs of ownership and operation are certainly those, and again, just the benefits of being able to support the agency's mission more fully. There's also some soft, non-pecuniary, non-tangible benefits that can result. Increased agency morale and improved public perception. So again, I know I'm speaking to a group here that's aware of it, but I did want to reiterate some of the importance of that. The project resulted in four main outputs: a user guide that serves as sort of I'll call it a primer to fleet replacement, talks about some of the life cycle cost analysis concepts, how it can be implemented, and how the tool actually uses it. The tool itself, again, I mentioned Excel-based, and a user manual that is more descriptive in the actual stepping through, prepping the tool, uploading the data, and actually running the analysis and interpreting the results. I'll speak to the first three. The final project report is basically a summation of those. So during the presentation, I'll speak to those first three. The guide was developed to meet those project objectives of developing a realistic cost analysis approach. And as I mentioned, it does outline some of the decision-making processes that folks should go through as they're going through their replacement planning process. It's meant to be both a handbook on that as well as an instruction manual for making those decisions. The intent of the guide is to help fleet managers determine the optimal life cycles as well as implement that approach for replacement planning. It's the result of data-driven analysis, and it's meant to be a tool to inform the decision making. It's not going to make that final decision for you, but the tool is meant to do that. You'll be able to quantify your replacement needs, develop justifiable budget requests to support those, to support the agency's mission, and then hopefully secure the needed funding to provide a dependable fleet to the agency's mission. Talk a lot in asset management about telling the story or communicating the needs to decision makers, and this tool will hopefully do that. As I mentioned, the user manual is a more detailed step-by-step process throughout or through using the tool. It provides background on again, installing the tool, customizing it to your agency's needs, importing the data in, and again, running the analysis. I've got a tool demonstration section here coming up later in the presentation. We'll be able to step through this in more detail, but I do think it's important to note at this point that you are able to customize several of the inputs in the tool to be tailored to your specific agency. I'm sure this graph looks familiar to you folks, but I did want to drop this in here and just hit a couple of the high points. Obviously, we've got our operating and ownership costs on there as well as the total cost to own. One of the important things to note through here is that based on our research, we found that the life cycle cost analysis isn't necessarily a single point in time, but rather a window with which you can make that decision. The curves on here appear smooth. In reality, that's not the case. The operating costs are going to vary from year to year, but we did smooth out those curves as part of the tool. These are the replacement factors that are included in the tool as part of the decision-making process. I am going to speak to each of these in more detail. They are in sum here. We use age in two ways in the tool, to express the optimal replacement cycle in the years, and then also as a long-term planning component to identify your replacement candidates. It's important to note here that age alone shouldn't be the sole factor for your replacement decision, and I will speak to that in a subsequent slide. I mentioned customizing the tool during initial setup. We developed some default replacement planning targets based on literature review and working with actually some of you folks here with your DOT data. With that said, again, during initial tool setup, we recommend a review of that to ensure that you're starting with those replacement planning targets that are most tailored to your agency. Another point on that, with many of these similar types of tools, it's obviously there's value in running a couple cycles through, so it might be best to get 2 or 3 planning cycles through and kind of take a holistic look back at those as you're going through the process. Utilization, another replacement factor. Obviously, it can vary greatly between units within the same class year to year. With that said, it stands to reason that older equipment is generally utilized less. But we did include this as a major component in the replacement decision. Obviously, another major component in the replacement decision, our research, we found about 30 to 40% of the total cost owned over its lifetime can be attributed to depreciation. This tool does not use the standard straight line or double declining method of depreciation. Ours is based on utilization and replacement cost. And I'll use a brief example as to why we sought to go in that direction. Let's say you have 2 pieces of equipment, both 8 years old, one with 100,000 miles and one with 150,000 miles. We didn't want to assume that those had the same residual value at the end. We wanted to account for that additional utilization. So as such, we were able to go through and work with some folks to identify salvage values based on DOT data and develop our depreciation curves. And I did mention the tool also is based on the current replacement value of the tool, which includes of the equipment, which includes initial upfitting. We wanted to do that to normalize the costs across the class. So again, it might look a little different than some of you folks are used to in terms of the depreciation method used. Again, with the customization, some folks are not able to keep the proceeds from equipment salvage auctions and resale. Sometimes that goes back into a general fund. If that's the case, you are able to tailor the tool to set your salvage value at 0 at a given age or utilization level. I know some of you folks have that unfortunate circumstance where you're not able to keep the resale. Maintenance and repair costs are included as well. Should include all repair types. Again, I won't read these off to you here, but I did mention earlier and just wanted to reiterate that the initial upfitting of the equipment we assigned to, or recommended is assigned to the capital cost of procuring that equipment. Again, based on our research, we've seen upwards of 40% of the cost of ownership as a result of maintenance and repairs. So a full accounting of this is certainly important in that overall life cycle cost process. I hesitate to bring it up, but we have rebuilds and overhauls on there. If anybody was at the SCOM meeting in Providence this year, that was the topic of some debate as to how to account for those. So, but they are included or recommended to be included in the maintenance and repair costs. Fuel prices obviously vary year to year. As a result, we put it into the tool so it uses an average annual fleet cost per mile for all the units in a given equipment class. Again, a significant component of the overall cost to own, anywhere between 20 and 40% based on our research. I will also note that the first iteration of the tool, fuel costs were a required field. after working with some of the panel members and some DOTs, we ran into some difficulties for some folks in getting fuel cost data. The reasons for that vary, but regardless, we are in the process of making that an optional field now, rather than required. Some folks, when we were going through testing and they were uploading their data, if they didn't have fuel cost information in there, the tool wasn't producing results. So in order to bypass the lack of results, we're making that an optional field now. It still is recommended. I'd like to take a little time talking about downtime. As we were going through the project and speaking with DOTs and interacting with the panel members, we found that relatively few agencies are tracking and utilizing downtime data. And while that doesn't necessarily result in additional expenditures, it certainly has an impact on your operations. If the equipment's not available, crews aren't able to go out and do their jobs, and again, not able to support the agency's mission, and in the end, it increases the cost of highway operations. Without the downtime data, we can be significantly understating the true cost of ownership. And again, based on our research, we saw anywhere of adding up to 50% to the total cost to own. It's not a required component in the tool, but again, recommended. And I should also note that one of the things that we're hopeful comes out of the project is again, a reiteration of the importance of fleet management, the data that's collected, how it's analyzed, and how it's eventually utilized to make those decisions. As I mentioned, we do have the functionality to use downtime data. There's some default values that are in there based on some default equipment hourly rental rates. But again, you're able to tailor that to your specific agency during initial tool configuration and setup. Condition and mission criticality. I'm not exactly sure how many of you folks are factoring this into your decision-making processes. This is familiar to me coming from the maintenance and asset management perspective. If you're going to work with some performance-based or level of service-based budgeting, you need to know what you have and what condition it's in. This isn't a factor in developing the optimal life cycle, but it is a factor in the replacement decision in the tool. And I'll speak to this in more detail as I demo it. But just to give you an idea, there is a suggested condition assessment form and a process outlined in the user guide that folks can look to for some guidance as to how to develop those condition assessment scores and bring them into the overall replacement decision. I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but at present, that form isn't linked back to the spreadsheet, so you complete the condition assessments, and then you have to manually tie those back to the equipment number. It was out of the current scope, but a proposed enhancement to the tool would be to develop some functionality to link those so you avoid the double entry and sort of the potential for errors that come with that, and also just saving the folks time from having to do the double entry. And as I mentioned, I will step through that form and demonstrate how that condition assessment score is able to be developed. During the project, we weren't exactly able to delve too deeply into agencies' financial and payroll data, but based on our discussions with fleet managers, it became fairly clear that there's a general sense that mechanic overhead rates might not be fully accounting for the total costs of those mechanic hourly rates. As you're aware, the mechanic shop overhead can be pretty significant today with the computers and software, diagnostic equipment, training, and the like. So it's a real cost that should be accounted for. Again, without those fully loaded rates, the life cycle cost analysis can be underestimating the total cost to own and pushing out that replacement window farther than might be optimal if you were given or if you were able to utilize the fully loaded rates. With that said, as part of the initial tool setup, we would recommend an agency work with their financial services folks to review overhead rates, what all goes into those, but both the payroll overhead and the like, to ensure that they are a full accounting of. Again, you're able to tailor those overhead rates. We do have some default values in the configuration file, but again, as part of the initial setup, we would recommend you review those and make sure that they are specific to your agency. The user guide has another feature in it as well, where you're able to review the suggested approach for calculating overhead. So again, it'll give you a starting point as you're looking to implement the tool. Obsolescence. It essentially looks at the efficiency and dependability of a piece of equipment. It's tough to quantify that for an overall vehicle, or looking at overall vehicle productivity, but we were able to quantify it based on fuel efficiency. Our research of CAFE data led to us to develop a default obsolescence rate of 2% a year, which essentially is saying that vehicles become 2% less efficient, fuel efficient per year. It's another one of those features that you're able to tailor specifically to your agency, but that 2% rate is applied to the fuel costs to factor in obsolescence. The replacement cost, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but we do use it in calculating the depreciation. Again, that was done to look at those purchase costs and replacement costs in constant dollars and normalize those throughout the analysis. Then they're also used to project the long-range budget needs over your 5-year planning cycle that we have built into the tool. The tool currently can use the average for the class. Now there's some intricacies in there where you might have a pickup and you might have 2- and 4-wheel drive in the same class of equipment. You can also use the majority or the cost that represents the majority of the pieces of equipment in the class. The main point to take away from this is you're able to tailor this replacement cost to whatever your agency's situation is. That's another feature that, again, I mentioned you can tailor, but we recommend as being included in part of the annual replacement planning process each year, or a review of those to ensure that those are in line with the reality of your agency. That's pretty much the replacement factors in the tool, and now I just wanted to step through the process that we've outlined in the guide. Again, I mentioned as part of the project purpose and objective was to develop a systematic approach to replacement planning. It involves both art and science. The tool is just that. It's a tool. It will inform the decision making. It won't make the decision for you. We start with the data, and throughout the process here, one of the things that we realized was the data quality, availability, consistency, accuracy varied pretty widely across agencies, and you know, I think you folks might be aware of that as well. One of the struggles that we had initially was just getting the data into a format that we could drop it in to Excel. It's one of the limitations. It's not quite as flexible as maybe some of the more advanced equipment management softwares, but that was an issue that we had. So beginning with the data is a key component throughout this process. Data scrubbing or data cleanup we found was very important. Based on some example data sets we got, we saw a lot of in-service years of 1900 or utilization of 500,000 miles a year, or you know, just some figures that were outside of what you might consider realistic for most folks. So again, the data cleanup and data scrubbing, very important and might be the most time-consuming process or time-consuming task in this process. I'm jumping ahead a little bit as well, but one of the proposed enhancements we have for the tool would be to set up some automatic data validation within the tool. Some of you folks who have equipment management systems might have access to that already, but again, if a utilization total was outside of a set range that the agency established, it could prompt you and say, "Are you sure?" essentially, for that extra level of checking to ensure that the data quality is sufficient to support effective analysis. We noticed several common types of data errors. I mentioned very high utilization. We also saw some very low utilization, and that might be the case. That might be accurate, but to assist in the analysis or enhance the analysis, some of the data scrubbing we recommend is to remove those extremely high or extremely low utilization units. I mentioned in service year of 1900 or not at all. Again, it was a fairly common error that we saw in data that was provided to us as we were developing the tool. We would see instances of negative costs in the cost column. Again, I know I'm sort of beating this down, but there were quite a few instances of data errors that we ran into, and I just really did want to drive home the importance of starting with good data. It's what's the consultant speak? The garbage in, garbage out. So again, just wanted to reiterate the importance of this as a process, starting with data quality. The lifecycle cost analysis will tell you when you should be replacing the equipment. It doesn't necessarily make the replacement decision for you. You all operate in a world of constrained resources where you can know what the right decision is, but you might The tool might tell you need a budget of $20 million for your equipment replacement, and you might have 10. The tool told you when you should. The art becomes knowing your constraints and what you're able to do with the budget that you have. So again, I'll get into some of this functionality when I demonstrate the tool, but I did want to, again, reiterate that this is a process, and the tool serves to inform that process. It doesn't make that decision for you. This slide's fairly generic, but we did notice, again, a need for maybe increased resources towards the field of fleet and equipment management and replacement. It's not you can't just simply upload the data and generate the outputs from the tool and expect that to be the best decision. As I mentioned, it still requires people to interpret the results, get out there, perform the condition assessments, establish your agency priorities, and coordinate with field offices and the like. It's not an easy process, but it's a very important one. And again, this slide I wanted to speak to that somewhat. For truly effective fleet management and replacement, it's going to require somebody available throughout the year to perform quality control and quality assurance on the data that's coming in, to again ensure that you're starting with a quality product to perform the analysis. Having said that, I understand that's easier said than done. I'm sure everybody wants to, well, maybe not clone themselves, but get a few more folks to help out. But again, it is important to have the resources available to effectively manage your operation. The tool itself, I mentioned in Excel. Again, it was set up that way because I'm imagining everybody in here has Excel on their machine. It's a fairly straightforward product to use. Now, with that said, it might not be the most the optimal tool to perform this analysis, but it is an effective tool given the scope of the project. The tool has 6 main functions. I won't read through these, but I will discuss each of these as I step through. We have a class-level lifecycle cost analysis. It's able to develop optimal replacement cycles for 40 equipment classes. Part of the tool configuration and setup, you have to match some of your equipment classes to the table in the tool. Again, it takes a little bit of effort, and there are some opportunities there for errors, but that is one of the features of the tool, matching your equipment class codes to, I don't know if generic's the right word, but the default class codes in the tool. Performs the lifecycle cost analysis by grouping all of the equipment units by age, calculates the life-to-date cost per mile for each of the components, parts, labor, fuel, commercial, etc. And the total cost per mile is obtained by totaling those, as well as the depreciation costs. And as I mentioned, I've got the tool demonstration here coming up after I step through, but I did want to just, at a high level, explain some of the functions of the tool. Once you develop your class-level lifecycle cost analysis and optimal cycles, you're able to identify replacement candidates. In the tool, it's got a tab that identifies those pieces of equipment that are either greater than 25% above the average cost for the class, or has exceeded its utilization target that you all set up in the tool. These are only candidates for replacement. As I mentioned, we recommend a condition assessment as well. So this identifies those candidates, but each unit should be evaluated individually. The tool ranks those units that have the highest percentage or have the highest cost per mile over the average class. So it's prioritized that way. And then there's also a feature in the tool which you'll see that it's a simple X that denotes whether or not it's exceeded its replacement target in terms of utilization. The condition assessment, this is a screenshot of the form, but again, it provides additional insight onto the individual units. This isn't required in the tool, but again, it's strongly recommended as part of the actual replacement process. Again, this does not impact the optimal cycle, but again, given that world of constrained resources, this is where you're able to prioritize some of those candidates for replacement. So you'll notice there's some weighting factors here for each body, engine, and the like. You're able to change those, again, based on agency priorities. We'd recommend that those total to 100, but the tool rolls them up proportionately, whatever your total is. But again, I'll demonstrate that in there, but I did want to just make note that this is another one of the configurable fields in the tool initial setup. As I mentioned, it's a proposed enhancement, but we would like to be able to eventually link these condition assessment forms directly into the tool, well, for those reasons I mentioned earlier. Prioritizing the replacement units. I mentioned the replacement candidates that, again, either exceed the class average by 25% or have exceeded their targets. Another feature, you're able to weight those two. So if you wanted to add less weight to the condition score, make it 50-50, you're able to do that as well. The tool will only show, in your prioritized replacement list, it will only show those units for which you do have condition assessment scores. So you might not see every unit come over if you've not performed your condition assessment on those. But again, this is another configurable field in the tool, and I'll demonstrate that as we go through. So we had the class level. We also have the unit level life cycle cost analysis feature in the tool. This is helpful if you don't have enough units in the fleet to feel comfortable performing a class level assessment. You're also able to examine the details, kind of drill down a little more deeply into an individual unit. There are two key requirements to perform the unit level. You need to make sure that it's tied to equipment classes that you've identified in the configuration file. And again, I'll show that. But you're also required to have annual cost and utilization data for each unit that you'd want to analyze over the course of its life. The class level is just life to date. The unit level needs annual cost and utilization numbers. Again, there might be some limitations for some folks on being able to get that data, but that is how the tool functions at this point. And again, I've mentioned the condition and mission criticality, but it's another feature that we recommend including in the replacement decision-making process. Once you've developed your class level, identified your priority candidates, unit level, you're able to look at your overall replacement program. Again, this tool informs the decision makers, but it's not going to make that decision for you. This is where some of the art comes in. We do have some guidelines for making that final decision when you have to choose between investing this dollar here or that dollar there. We recommend using those priority rankings as a starting point, and then again incorporating that condition assessment as well as some of the unit level to identify the individual trends. The 5-year plan budget. This is again able to help you forecast some of your long-term planning needs. MAP 21 speaks about 5-year. You have your long-range plans. 5 years seems to be a nice round number, but what this is able to do is able to estimate 5 years out when your units will be due for replacement. You're able to identify the backlog that you currently have as well as forecast your needed expenditures for each of those 5 years out. It's an optional step in the process, but it will show you once you've developed your optimal life cycle for the class, this will show you the cost consequences. Let's say it was 8 years, 120,000 miles. This will show you the cost consequences of replacing it at 10 years or 6 years or whatever the suboptimal replacement cycle would be. And again, I'll demonstrate these features when I open up the tool. But essentially, this is able to, again, communicate that need, tell the story of, it demonstrates the cost of delayed equipment replacement, and hopefully builds a business case that folks are able to use when they go to the decision makers in terms of funding. Tool demonstration. Okay, well, here we go. This is not my machine, so I hope I don't limp through this too awful much at this point. This is the configuration file. This is the one I mentioned where you can tailor these values to your agency. Anything with a white cell, you should be able to edit and customize to your agency. I've got some default agency class codes in here, some example replacement costs, downtime rates, and the like. Planning year 2017. Again, I've got a default set of data that I was able to use, so this is the class code for sedans. Again, a default replacement cost, downtime rate. If you had that data, you're able to customize that. Some of the other factors that you're able to update. Your overhead rate. Again, these are default based on literature review and working with some of the folks on the panel as well as other DOTs. excuse me, but you are able to tailor those. A default inflation rate of 2.5%, and that obsolescence rate of 2% that I mentioned earlier. We'll see the results, and then I will update those, and you can see how it affects the results overall. So we have a sedan class. I'm going to open up my data entry file. This data entry file, I've pre-populated to save myself limping through it, but about 151 or so units in the sedan class. I'm going to go back to my configuration file so we can see again that we've got current replacement cost estimated at $15,000 and an average age of 6 years or 90,000 miles. I'm going to open up the sedan analysis tab, or worksheet I should say, and I'll do this off the start so you can see how this functions. And while I'm doing this, I will note that one of the issues we ran into with folks being able to produce results was, at present, the tool does require that you save it directly to the C drive. I know from experience that if you try to save it in your own folder, it's not going to work. I made that mistake the second time I went through to try and test originally. So one of the proposed enhancements that we have is to develop a splash screen that prompts you upon opening the tool to save it in the proper location. And I assume I'll have to do another step here that has also been a hanging point for some folks, but it's a fairly common Excel, I don't even want to call it an error. Oh, we didn't have to, but oftentimes you'll have to enable the content and then also refresh the data at times. It's just one of the ways that Excel is working. But based on those criteria that we set up, the tool has identified an optimal replacement year of 10 years or 102,000 miles. I can show you, if we go back to the configuration file, and we can update it. Let's update it to $20,000 and see the results. And again, I might have to, nope, it did update automatically. You remember it was 10 years, 102,000 miles before. With a $20,000 replacement target, it's showing 11 years, 112,000 miles. And again, that's using that default data set that we had developed just for today. What you're able to do at this point, if you wanted, was to go and update those planning targets. Again, it's not required at this point, but as I mentioned earlier, you might want to look at a couple cycles or a couple sets of data to ensure that you're comfortable with the results. The replacement targets I mentioned here, let's see. I mentioned it was sorted by the percent over the class average. So equipment number 12164 is 627% over the class average. As a result, it's prioritized first, but you'll notice it has not yet exceeded its replacement target. But again, this is prioritizing based on first based on the cost over the class average. You'll notice these condition assessment scores are not filled out. I'm going to open up the condition assessment form now and show you how you can develop those scores and then incorporate them back, and then show you how that factors into the replacement process. I would like to note that you can obviously download this in electronic format if your folks who would be performing the condition assessments were comfortable using a tablet or laptop. That would again save you the step of transferring it back over. But with that said, it's not required. You can do that however you'd like. One of the recommendations that we've developed is to include this as part of your annual preventive maintenance or inspection process. Again, that's might be easier said than done, but it would be a way to gather these condition assessment scores and incorporate them into your replacement planning. You are able to establish the mission criticality. So for some folks in snow country, plows might be high, and if they have a mower or something that's not quite as important, they can put it on the low. But you are able to tailor this to whatever your agency feels is appropriate. I'll just use moderate for now. I mentioned the weights. Currently 15, 20, 20, 20, etc. Again, you can change these to whatever you'd like. At present, just with these default values, we've got a condition score of 47.8. 100 the best, 0 is the worst. So I'm just going to play with these a little bit just to, again, show you how the form works and how you can bring those back in. So I'm going to move the body from very poor to good, engine to fair, transmission to poor, steering suspension to very poor, electrical to poor, just as an example. And again, we've raised that score to 61.5. As I mentioned, you can change any of those weights as you see fit. Part of the conversation you all would have when you're setting up the tool initially. But let's use 61.5, or we'll round it to 62. We'll go back into our analysis tab. That one we said was 62. I'm just going to make up example numbers for others as well. So we've got some example data in there. I'm going to flip over to the priority replacement list and show you how that then impacts this tab. Again, I had to refresh all there. It's a fairly common thing as we're stepping through. So remember, we had the weight of 40 to 60 for cost to condition. I know it might be difficult to remember offhand, but try to remember these priority numbers in terms of your replacement priority. And I'm going to go back to the configuration file and update the weighting. Everybody remembers them, right? Another driver to put it in a little bit more robust software would be the reporting's a little easier. If you're not running it in Excel, something more robust, Access or something would return the results quicker. There we go. And it did flip some of those around based on that weighting. And again, I don't know if it was worth that weight, but I did want to demonstrate that you are able to tailor those. One of the things I'd also like to note, we had those default values for replacement targets. When we did that, it identified 107 units for replacement. I'm going to go back to the configuration file, and I'm going to update our sedan replacement utilization to, let's go to 75,000. There we go. So it pulled in an additional 7 or 8 units. That's because they exceeded that 75,000 mile utilization target. So that's how this replacement targets tab works in terms of identifying those candidates for replacement. As I mentioned, if you had condition assessment scores for each of these, it would then bring you over into your priority replacement list. We only put in 5 condition assessment scores, so that's where it's where it's developing that priority replacement list. I'm going to show you quickly how to. That was the class level. I'll show you quickly how to perform unit level analysis. Pretty much the same process. We've set it up in the configuration file as well, again with those agency class codes and some default values for the current replacement. Let's pick one for miles. You're able to break it out by equipment that's utilization that's reported in both miles and hours. Unit level miles. And as I mentioned, you need to have annual totals for the unit level analysis. Here's the example of what you would look at if you were performing unit level analysis on a sweeper with, again, the annual data that you're able to gather from your equipment management system. Here's some of those default values that you would see in the configuration file. Again, here's your information in the configuration file for the sweeper. Replacement cost of $184,000, $80 per hour downtime rate, 12-year, 120,000 mile replacement target. If we go back to the unit level, you're able to see the lowest cost year to date, again, both graphically and in tabular form. And that's the process is the same for equipment that works on hourly meters as well. I'll jump back to the class level and show you the ability to identify your replacement budgets. Here's that 5-year schedule, again, based on a $20,000 replacement cost, current inflation rate, 2.5%. This is your backlog. This is telling you $1.8 million in backlogged equipment that's already exceeded that replacement target, and this is your estimated cost to replace for years out. The blank spot here must be because of data or equipment units not coming in service or coming due for replacement, within 4 years. But you are able to, again, forecast replacement needs. This is probably one of the things that folks are familiar with the backlog of the existing replacement budget. But again, this is looking at that 5-year schedule. Again, it's showing those units that will become due for replacement for each of those 5 years moving forward. I mentioned the cost consequences tab. This will show you, what did we say it was again? It was 10-year, or 11-year, 112,000. So if we go down to 11 year. You'll see that this is the lowest point on that life cycle cost analysis curve, but it will quantify the cost of that delayed equipment replacement. As you can see, as you push it out, in year 15, we see $610,000 for the annual cost class, but we're at $572 and change if it's based on the optimal replacement cycle identified in the tool. I can show another class if you'd like, or I can kind of turn it over to questions. I'm not sure what you folks would think is the best, but I can step through additional equipment classes or show you the unit level analysis for an hourly meter or whatever might be most beneficial.
Is the report final? Is it published?
I believe the question was, is the report finalized and published? Lisa, no. We received comments from Amir, I believe it was last week, on the most recent version. So it's my understanding that it is not finalized yet, but I did want to mention that some of those proposed enhancements, I guess maybe I should have done that. I jumped ahead. I mentioned a few of the enhancements. We had the splash screen, which will prompt a user to save it in the right location. We ran into some errors with leading zeros in equipment numbers. We've addressed that and will allow for those now to avoid erroring out on some of those. I mentioned the fuel cost data not being required. In the version of the tool that I'm using, it is, but the updated version that's currently in development will not require that, even though, again, it is recommended. I've hit on several of these already, but we would recommend building this tool into more robust software. Access or something web-based would help. I mentioned the data validation feature that would help folks scrub data on the front end. In general, adding downtime and tracking equipment downtime as part of just your standard equipment management processes would help develop a more robust lifecycle cost analysis. Again, a review of those mechanic hourly rates and overhead to ensure that those are fully loaded, the condition assessment form being linked back to the tool, and again, just a refocus on the importance of the resources devoted to equipment management and training on this process are things as well. But back to your question, Lisa, the report will include these proposed enhancements as well as the ones here that I mentioned, and these will be reflected in the tool, the ones on this slide here.
So the NCHRP has been talking about how to roll this out. I mean, we've followed through with the research for the past 3 years. We just don't want it to sit on a shelf somewhere. And so I guess a question for you, Jeff, is will this be downloadable? Will it, is it going to be maybe in hard copy form? What's the best way that we're going to be able to get this out to the DOT fleet managers?
Well, my opinion would be in any format possible. I err on the side of electronic format, but certainly if folks were in favor of a published copy of the user guide and tool manual, I think there's value in the tool user guide in and of itself. As I mentioned, it's a primer on some of the concepts of effective fleet replacement and life cycle cost analysis. So that in itself, I think, would be a valuable tool for some folks as they're going through the process. But
is any of this proprietary, or can we use bits and pieces of it with an existing system that we already have?
The question was, are any of these features in the tool proprietary? And it's my understanding, I don't want to speak outside of my level of confidence here, but it is an NCHRP project, so any of those features you would be able to use. That I shouldn't have harped on the limitations of Excel as much as some of the benefits. Again, if you have data from, I know your SAP system, Chris, you can dump it in there. So no, it's not proprietary in the sense that Dye Management owns it or somebody else owns it.
So I believe it's probably going to be the easiest for the oversight panel just to have it put on the MTSP website, and then folks can just download it from there. So a couple other follow-up questions. So if my fleet information management system, if most of my information is corrupt, I could get some, I guess, some ballpark idea of optimum replacement cycle just by using the default data. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. And again, that's based on a literature review and from real data that we got from both panel members and then other agencies as well. So yes, it would be a tool to ballpark it for you. And again, there's literature out there, but the tool would help you with that. Obviously, we'd recommend your data to be most specific to you, but to get you started, yes, it could be used as a ballpark figure.
So if I had good miles, hours data, and I had good age data, but how about my operating costs were corrupt? Could I just enter limited amount of data and use my own equipment to run the model?
You could. Again, obviously, the more full data set you have, the more accurate, complete data set you have, the more robust the analysis is going to be. I'm not remembering right offhand exactly what fields are still required. I know because, again, there's been some changes, but again, fuel is optional and some of those others are optional as well.
Recently, the Special Committee on Research and Innovation has set aside $2 million to help implement NCHRP projects that completed. We've seen them come through, and like they've had new software for culverts, and they've got out and set up classes for $200,000 where they bring people in to teach them how to use the software and such like that. At the end of the project is usually when the project panel gets together and makes a decision if this would be something that would be enhanced by tech transfers or training. Has your panel talked about this and maybe made a proposal to ask for funding for some type of training on the software? Because this is the hardest part with NCHRP is getting from report to then implementation by the states. So has your panel considered that, and is this something you'd like to pursue or would like a recommendation for pursuing?
I'm going to quickly pass the buck to any panel members.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, so the exciting part about this is there is 13-06 that is going to kick off once this one is finalized. And what that is long-range planning. And the same panel that worked on 1304 is going to roll into 1306 because the idea is that there could be a phase 2. There could be a what's next. They could tie together, the two tools together. And so as soon as the panel is formed and we start working on the RFP, that will be determined.
But in the interim, if a state wants to roll this out, if you guys went for the funding separate, I mean, the funding's there. The TRP panel, your chaperone through TRP knows about the process. It's outside the TRP funding, and it would just compete. And the example I'd give is maybe you would offer a class at next year's thing where you can actually bring people in and they would learn how to use the software tool and it'd give a hands-on approach of how you input and maybe start the process of how a state would then start using the spreadsheet. Because you are waiting for a 3-year to 4-year term for the next iteration. And I don't know if there's interest now in the states waiting that long or if they want to start the input process earlier.
EMTSP panel member, I will bring that to the group and we can talk about it. But I think it's a very good idea because if I know when we test drove it at my DOT, there was some frustration from some of the analysts on how to get the tool up and running. But we had direct access to DI, and so that solved that problem. And in the future, they're not going to be on the retainer, so we're not going to have that access. Other DOTs may not have that access, so there is some work to be done.
I was just going to make a comment about the follow-up. We actually, when we were at the subcommittee on maintenance, the panel, the EMTSP oversight panel, talked about when we have our conference next year to actually having convening one day early and having like a workshop to go through this whole process. The idea was received well, and if we could get some funding to get the analysts there, that would help. So I think, and I know that Bruce's staff has test drove it. We got a copy also because Jeremy Matsuo is on the panel as well and did some test driving. So we're going to do as much as we can before we, get to go to the next conference and maybe do that workshop. So
I've been telling my management about this research line going for 2 years, trying to basically be enthusiastic about the tool in and of itself. So I would like to start using it. So where you have test drove it, what was your experience as far as time, getting it up to speed? What kind of resources or did it take for you to get up there so that I can go back and start creating a planning around getting the tool and what it would take to do that? Because right now I have no idea.
Yeah, we did. We test drove it several different times, and what we identified is we don't believe that this tool will ever completely replace our condition model per se. It does really well of comparing apples to apples, meaning if you're going to try to identify what you want to replace within your sedans, what you want to replace within motor graders, et cetera, it compares them pretty well to each other, but not against each other. So there's still going to be some management influence that takes place in how much money you put into the different classes of code replacement. So did that answer your question?
I'm more concerned about, you said you had some analysts involved. How much time did the analysts spend basically bringing the tool up, inputting data, looking at data to where you had usable product?
Well, the first time around it was new, and so we have AssetWorks FA Suite, and it's all downloadable into, so she was able to bulk load a lot of the data, but it did take her some time to get used to the guide to begin with, read through it and all that stuff. The second time around, she already had the data. So, and so it's just updating the data on an annual basis. So the first time, it does take some care and feeding to get your data in line, make sure that you've got good, solid data.
A number around the care and feeding the first time, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, how many man
To
hours?
prepare the data?
Well-
No, I would say it probably took her a day and a half to 2 days.
Oh, okay.
And then Oregon 2, we implemented the assessment tool. So we saw a presentation from Caltrans last year at the National, where you guys had a separate assessment process. And so once this was opened up, we were able to distribute that. And our staff really likes it. And we are doing it with our annual inspections. And we started out small. We started just with our 10-yard trucks because we wanted to have a good, solid assessment of what those look like. And so far, it's working pretty well. But we haven't incorporated it into the tool. It's a separate management tool that we're using.
I'm curious how important the downtime parameter is in the analysis and the units that the downtime is and what it considers if it's crew time lost and those type of factors.
Well, sure. Yeah. Essentially, in brief, anytime the equipment is unavailable and it's tracked in hours of downtime in the tool, as I mentioned, it goes into more detail in the guide. In terms of importance, again, based on some research, we found that it can add up to 50% to your cost to own. So it can be significant. But that being said, it's not required in the tool. But as part of just a general practice, we would recommend looking at incorporating downtime into your data reporting and analysis.
Second question for Excel, if you have a very large fleet, do you have to break it into vehicle classes and run those separately, or what are the data limitations running this in Excel?
I won't be able to speak to them specifically. I know Excel inherently has some trouble with very large data sets. I don't know what that specific number would be, or equipment units that I would recommend. You did see with the size of data set that we were using here, there was some sluggishness in terms of response for the reporting. But I can get you a better answer as to if there's a set limit in terms of the equipment units that you would want to be using in your class level analysis.
So would it be an upgrade to get it to have your formulas work out of Access?
I believe so. Yeah. Again, it's out of scope for this project, but it would certainly be an upgrade, or again eventually into something web-based, so that folks are able to go about it that way. But certainly an upgrade to Access would be beneficial.
One of the issues that just popped into my mind when we first test drove it is in the medium-duty fleet, we couldn't differentiate between gasoline and diesel engines within the tool. Is that an upgrade that's coming out in the last release?
I don't believe so.
Is that something where we could, since there's 40 fields or 40 equipment groupings that are in there, is there something that we could replace, pull one out and put in a diesel formula? Because most DOTs are running different replacement cycles for the gas versus diesel engine.
Again, I don't know offhand. I'm not as fluent in Excel development as the developers who were used, but I understand where you're coming from with just substituting in for another equipment class, and I'll check with Ron and those folks who are more directly involved in the development of the tool to see if that would be an option.
So my question is actually a follow-up on your question. So in your guys' structure, do you call like a pickup, for example, regardless of fuel type, is it the same class? Is that the problem you're running because you've got some that are gas and some that are diesel, but they're the same actual class number?
No.
No. Okay, because we run different classes for gas and diesel, and so you do as well. Okay. I guess I didn't understand your question.
Yeah. The tool isn't set up right now, so if you have a F-350 one-ton grouping, and if it was gas and it was diesel, the tool is only taking into consideration the gasoline engine and not the diesel. Meaning that our replacement cycle is 8 years, 130,000 miles for a gasoline engine, but it's 10 years and 230,000 miles for a diesel engine. So basically, we can't put our diesel fleet into, our medium-sized diesel fleet into this tool.
So your replacement's not by class then?
It is replaced by class, but we can't enter the diesel class in there. You could open it up and show, we got 5 more minutes, maybe you could open up and show the 40 classes of equipment.
Yeah, I believe we've got them outlined here. I know folks have a hard time seeing. Let me see if I can.
The half-ton, three-quarter ton, those are set up as gasoline engines and not as diesel engines. So I guess the question is you have it at 8 years, 110,000 miles. Could I run it once that way for a gas engine, and then could I go back and change it to 10, 230 to use the same frame?
I see what you mean. Yes, you should be able to do that as long as, again, you update your data entry file. You can set these targets with whatever you'd like, and then again run it through with your, just update it in your data entry file. And then the LCCA class level will give you that optimal cycle in years and utilization. You'd want to separate them out in here. That's how I would think you'd be able to do that.
Okay, run it 2 separate times. So does that kind of clarify? Where do you go?
I'm right here.
Oh. Disappearing X. So does that kind of explain? See, there isn't 2 groupings right now where you can enter gas and diesel engines and then run the tool and let it come through and give you an evaluation of each one. You have to do either gasoline and then go back, scrub the data, and then run the diesel.
So back to that, if you go back to that one screen, you were just on it, listed all your classes. So are you saying, like in this case right here, a 1531 3/4 ton pickup is both, you can have both gas and diesel in the 1531 class? Is that where the problem's coming into? Okay, see, in ours, we've actually identified, we've got a completely different class for a diesel pickup. So it'll be like 1531 for gas and then 1532 for diesel. So I guess that was my question. So to us, I don't know if that really pertained because...
Well, the tool set up for these, there's
Yeah.
40 classes.
Oh, so we would have to custom,
Yeah.
got it.
You would.
Makes sense now.
You would, if it was your half-ton pickup, your 1530 would be in the column A. That's your agency class code. Excuse me. That's your agency class code. So, like Bruce was mentioning, you would basically have to run that twice, where you change your configuration file to match those 2 agency class codes. Does that make sense?
Instead of adding another line item and saying 3/4 ton pickup and then having a fuel type.
That would be an enhancement to the tool. You could work around it now by doing that process, but yes, at this time we have these 40 classes where again you'd have to kind of run it separately.
I just really a question for both of you. Just kind of clarify when, like some sort of timeline when you think this is going to be complete or published or usable.
The last feedback was given to dye management, I think it was due the end of September and through the NCHRP. So it was provided to dye. Dye is in the process of doing the upgrades, and so we're hoping soon, but I don't think there's a finite date. So it's months, not years.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, again, I'm not involved in the panel discussions directly. That's more Ron's department, but I can't imagine it being later than the end of this year. At least, again, I don't know in terms of scheduling final project meetings and things, but in terms of the tool and report being finalized, I don't see that taking again through the end of the year. These couple enhancements that we were talking about and buttoning up the report, at least on our end, shouldn't be honestly through the end of the month. I don't want to overpromise for Ron, but I can't see that now. Again, I know we've run into some issues with just scheduling panel meetings and getting everybody together. We've got a diverse group of folks from across the country, so that might be a hang-up, but in terms of tool development and finalizing the report, that shouldn't be too awful much longer.
So with that, it is right on time, so it's 9:30, it's break time.
The preceding video was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found at tsp2.org. That's tsp2.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.